give us a little time and then we'll get started. I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is the Overture to Season 2 of TRILLOQUY. Thanks so much for sticking with us during our little break. We're so glad to be back with you. I'd like to go ahead and welcome as our special guest co-host for this Overture to TRILLOQUY, Vanessa Rose. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be here.
So, a lot is going on, to say the least, and we're all feeling all sorts of ways. But, this is a moment in which I believe that conversations at the intersection of race, identity, social justice, and the arts, this is that moment. This is so important. So what we have planned for this Overture to Season 2 of TRILLOQUY is to have a conversation and also introduce you to the new format of Season 2 moving forward. So each opus of TRILLOQUY is going to be chopped up into 4 separate movements. The first will check our accidentals. We'll bring you some of our thoughts surrounding the current status of the arts through a sharp, flat, or natural. The second movement is when we will strike a chord by sharing with you a piece of music that we find really intriguing or really relevant to the moment. In the third movement of each opus of TRILLOQUY, we will invite a guest to take a stand, so to speak, a little double entendre there. And then the final opus of TRILLOQUY is what we have called the TRILLOQUY. Scott and I will present an idea or a conversation that we think is really true and real when it comes to the arts and what's going on. So that's what we're going to do today in a sort of compacted example for you to get a taste of what's ahead for Season 2 of TRILLOQUY. So I want us to go ahead and jump right in. So as we check our accidentals, I'm thinking about the very sharp reactions that the country and the world has had to the murder of George Floyd. I want to ask the both of you. Police brutality is an issue that is not new to us or an issue that isn't new to the world. Is this level of reaction one that either of you expected?
Honestly, no. No.
Why not?
I absolutely expected protests, and to be completely honest, I think this has been such a learning moment for me for so many reasons. I knew that there were tensions in Minneapolis. I knew that there are longtime issues with the police department, and I knew that my friends like you in the Black community have felt incredibly racist experiences on a daily basis. And of course, that is not unique to Minneapolis. I didn't anticipate being so close to it physically. And that's my complete naivete and lack of experience. And that definitely, that's the epicenter is my neighborhood. And that made it very different for me. And, it's complicated for everybody, but yeah. I absolutely support this movement. I absolutely am demanding that our political leaders, this is my city mayor, this is my state governor now. I'm a voting citizen in Minnesota now, and they have to do more, and they have to be accountable. And I'm not hearing enough yet. You don't have to go too far into this, but I'm not hearing enough yet about real change. There's the what's happening to our city right now, but I don't expect anybody to subside any anger or try to go back to, quote, normalcy until we know that there is going to be a change. And I think absolutely it needs to be demanded.
Yeah, you mentioned Mayor Fry, mayor of Minneapolis, and then there's Melvin Carter, mayor of St. Paul, and then Governor Walz. Scott, I don't want any of their jobs on a normal during a normal time. Now I can't even imagine.
No. I've had a lot of sleepless nights here this past week. I imagine each one of them probably hasn't slept.
Oh, not at all.
And the gut check the gut check that is, you're right, man. I don't think that's a doable job.
You know, both Vanessa and I are relatively new twin citizens, but Scott, you've been here for a while, and you were actually around during the last local instance of extreme police brutality when Philando Castile was murdered. You know,
Yeah.
from your perspective, as someone who was here for that, what is the difference between that incident and this most recent one? Because the reaction to Philando Castile was nothing like the reaction to George Floyd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I remember was that things around Philando Castile, the protests were largely peaceful, and there was no violence at night. Now we're right on the edge of it because was it Friday night? Was it Thursday or Friday night that they got into Grand Avenue in St. Paul? Did you say, Garrett?
Oh yeah, that was one of those nights.
I think it was Thursday.
Okay, that's a 5-minute drive from downtown St. Paul in our studios. So it's not hard to say, okay, it was all Minneapolis the first night. They're mobilizing into St. Paul then for Thursday night. Why wouldn't it continue to grow this way?
Yeah.
The precinct, the police precinct near my house has heavy National Guard presence, barriers all over the place. You can't even get by. And with the interstates closing down at 7 o'clock at night, now to get back and forth to work, I'm driving through neighborhoods that I do not feel safe in.
You know,
And
I went Saturday or Sunday morning. I drove over to Midway in St. Paul, and for folks who are watching this and aren't local to Minnesota, Midway is this area that has historically had a lot of racial tension when it comes to gentrification. You know, a community of color that has constantly faced attempts of breaking it apart. You know, it's not far from where I moved from where I settled, you know, when I first came here to the Twin Cities. So of course I wanted to see with my own eyes, you know, what the wreckage actually looked like. And to walk down that sidewalk that I had walked down so many times, and just to see all of the broken glass, all of the rubble, the burnt out buildings was one thing. But I'm gonna tell you what really what I had a sharp reaction to. There's a pawn shop on University that I used to go in all the time, you know, looking for the next cheap thing, seeing what instruments they happen to have on the wall. As I walked in front of that store and saw it, all of the windows busted out, and saw it, you know, completely looted, I couldn't help but to, you know, climb through one of those broken windows and get the inside look. And being in that space, a space that has finally seen the impact of systemic racism in a very physical way, I was without words. To be in that space, to be in an area where I suppose a police officer could come at any moment and arrest me for trespassing or whatever. You know, I had a sharp reaction to that. But all in all, how is that different than my everyday life? You know, is what I've thought about. My heart goes out to you, Scott, feeling unsafe on your coming and goings to and from work. I am, and we'll get more into this in the last movement in the Triloquy, but for one of the first times in my life, I am moving around feeling completely comfortable. If I were driving my car and I saw a group of protesters, I have no fear of that. If anything, I would cheer it on, because it's time for these levels of change. You know,
Yeah.
we've reduced, and again, we're going to get more into this in the final movement, but we've reduced so much of this conversation lately. You know, as we're speaking now with the nationwide violence that we saw last night. You know, I don't think that this conversation should be centered around the idea that people are looting and enacting violence. Where I center this conversation is that we are reaping what we have sown as a country. For 400 years, we have planted seeds of hate, seeds of racism, and this is what grows from that. So this is not something concerning, policing, concerning, quelling looting and violence in light of this tragedy. I think everything we are seeing is the residual effect, the residual impact of systemic racism. It's an issue that so many institutions and organizations have the privilege of ignoring for many years now. Those institutions can't ignore it now because their building is burned down.
There was a quote by guitarist Milos Karadzic that I played on the air a few nights ago, where he was talking about his hand injury and talking about how in America you only address the symptom, not the cause. And as I'm listening to that go out over the air, I'm like, oh my God, how close, how much more prescient and meaningful was that quote right now. We can't keep just treating the symptom.
Absolutely.
And to state the obvious, this is compounded by what we're experiencing with COVID-19, which, as we already know, has disproportionately affected communities of color, more deaths. People are out of work. People don't have homes. I mean, it's interesting even to see what some of the images showing people looting, what they're walking out with, right? It's supplies, it's food. I even saw this incredible picture of a man carrying a black doll, presumably for his child or relative. I mean, nothing happens in isolation, as we know, and this is not an isolated incident, nor will actual systemic change be one isolated act.
Absolutely. Well, in normal productions of Trilloquy, the movements will be, separated by whatever Scott decides to do with his magic hands and his Ableton. But for this overture, I think the movements are going to be ataka, if I may use a music term. So I want to transition into the strike a chord movements. So I think it goes without saying that Joel Thompson's Seven Last Words of the Unarmed has really been making an appearance in so many areas. And I want to kick off this part of the conversation by acknowledging Ryan Lohr, the music director at American Public Media, home to Classical 24, where both Scott and I host radio. On the night before, this was the national news that it is now, when this still very much felt like a community issue here in the Twin Cities, Ryan asked that I air that piece of music. And, the way radio works, for folks who've never listened to either of us on the radio, our shifts begin what we call a billboard. So we say a few words with music in the background to kind of give the space and set the mood for what the listener is about to hear in the hour. For listeners on Classical 24, almost 300 client stations of classical music across the country, for them to hear the words sung, "I Can't Breathe," as the opening to my time with them in light of that tragedy, was something that I almost could not handle. I was pulling, holding back tears, not only for the Floyd family, but thinking about how historic of a moment that was. And Scott, I want you to speak to this. Have classical have classical radio listeners ever, and let's really exaggerate this, in the history of classical radio, even just the history of Classical 24, when was the last time you can pinpoint the airing of a piece of music that directly names and addresses police brutality, and having that picture painted for them through the lens of someone who is Black and someone who has that experience? For me, it felt like a historic moment. It felt like the responsibility was so large, and almost one that I almost, felt like was too much of a responsibility for me. I mean, surely you can understand those emotions.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I can't fathom what the weight of that was. And it's a really easy answer. I can't pinpoint a time where anything close to it has been aired on our service. So
that
if you
really,
want
go
to
ahead.
if you want to take that and our 250 client stations around the country, every single one of those has some sort of web presence where people can stream. We have an international presence. That was definitely a moment right there, the first time ever.
And as you can imagine, there were some emails about, well, well, music is supposed to be our escape, and why are you doing, and those emails were few in comparison to the
Mm-hmm.
hundreds, and I'm talking literally, like it's I'm embarrassed that I cannot keep up with it and reach back to all these people, the hundreds of emails that I got from folks, especially Black folks, who said to me that for the first time they felt affirmed. They felt like someone that they can speak to is presenting classical music, and again,
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I'm not framing this around good job, Garrett, but what a responsibility. And this is all too late. It's the year 2020. So many of these conversations that I initiate are ones that I felt like should have been initiated decades ago, but people have really worked so hard to preserve that safe white space of classical music. Surely, Vanessa, that's something that you have experienced firsthand as well.
Yes, I do.
if I may put you on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of these conversations were initiated, and they have been, and that's where I think we have this moment today to make sure it goes farther than it has been able to in the past. Can I just offer one more thing, because this is something I think about just in terms of context a lot through my work at ACF, which is and having the great pleasure of having spent some time with Joel and the amazing artist and person that he is. We have to honor him as an artist and what this piece represents. And I'm really glad to see a lot of my colleagues now saying we are going to program more artists in our season, more Black artists, more artists of color, and solidarity. I'm so grateful. Please don't put this piece on your season and think that you're done. It's
Mm-hmm.
been amazing to see the University of Michigan. They created the Sphinx organization first premiered this piece, and then at University of Michigan, where Eugene Rogers was, there's a whole website devoted to this piece. So please take a look. Tallahassee Symphony, I know, also performed it, and they did a series of conversations around the performance itself to really elevate what this means. And the music, I'm getting chills thinking about it. The music itself is incredibly powerful. Please also do justice for who is represented in this music and who wrote this music by adding context and encouraging conversation in addition to listening to the music. So that's my
Garrett,
soapbox.
I think personally, I think it's only right that you were the one to air it and talk about it. I think that I don't think it would have been appropriate. And I think the fact that it was done overnight when we have our largest possible audience, that was precisely the right spot to put it, I think.
But what would it mean if I very rightfully said, in this moment, I am, I call, our boss or whatever, hours before I'm supposed to go on the air and say, this is weighing down on me.
Yeah.
I do not at all have the mental capacity to engage millions of white people in programming that is mostly white. I'm not asking if I would be justified in that, because I feel like I would be. Scott, what I'm asking you is, what do you think would be the appropriate reaction to that, understanding that, you and I agree that I was the right person to present that to our audience? What would it mean if I couldn't do that? Who would it be? How would it be? Is that something that you would feel comfortable doing? I'll ask you that. Is that would you feel comfortable producing and talking over a billboard of Joel Thompson's Seven Last Words of the Unarmed? And if so, what would you say?
What I've learned the last several weeks, and in particular this last week, I would have to try, and I would go out there with the very language of, hey, I don't know how to do this, but you need to hear this. And if you listen to nothing else from front to back the rest of this month or the rest of your life, listen to this. And then I would just get out of the way.
We talk about that, powerful, visceral concert experience in general, the power of listening to live classical music. I can say in complete honesty, the first time I saw that piece of music performed live, I was actually in the audience of the video that everyone is sharing, I wept and sobbed more than I ever had in a concert experience. That was
Yeah.
by far the most visceral concert experience I had ever had. I mean, but Vanessa, I'd love to, for you to paint the picture of your first interaction with this piece of music.
I have not heard it performed live, unfortunately. It's all been through recorded mediums. But again, I think having the opportunity to spend time with Joel has made it so much stronger for me. And he actually wrote a new piece that was recently premiered here in Minnesota by Vocal Essence, that I sat next to him for, which
Yeah.
was
Wow.
also just extraordinary. I mean, for me, it still becomes very personal and this is why I love working with living composers, living artists, music creators, because they're living in our time, right? They're reflecting in their own voice and their own experience, the same world that I'm living in. And I learned so much. Yeah. And I'm so glad that he's getting a lot of, that he's getting rightful attention and people are seeing the value of such an extraordinary piece. There's so many other pieces too. I hope will also get attention, which is something that we're working to at ACF.
Think about what's being created right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also, Courtney Bryan wrote a piece, Yet Unheard, specifically about women who had been
which is also
victims
very
of police
important.
brutality, which often doesn't get as much attention.
Right.
Sandra Bland specifically for this piece.
Yeah, and then may we also name Breonna Taylor, who recently lost her life to police violence. So yeah, may we continue to lift up Joel Thompson, his
Absolutely.
work. And if you are unfamiliar with 7 Last Words of the Unarmed, stop what you're doing right now. Go to YouTube and check out that performance. Is one of the most important pieces of classical music, certainly of the 21st century, and I think of our time. So very important for you to consume that bit of media. All right, so as we transition here to movement 3 called Take a Stand, Vanessa, as I think about the traditional symphony, it's that third movement that is usually the fun one. When you talk about the symphonies of Florence Price or William Grant Steele, that's the Juba dance movement. Even if you go all the way back to those Mozart symphonies, that's always the really fun minuet and trio. But, unfortunately, that can't be the case for this third movement of Triloquy. In the way that you've decided to take a stand as the president CEO of American Composers Forum, I think is very notable. I would love for you to rewind back before these latest strings of tragedies and explain to us and everyone watching why you decided to prioritize racial equity when it comes to the work that the American Composers Forum is doing.
How long do you have? Let's see. Well, I'll say it was already it was always already identified as a priority for the organization. And even before I started, there had been funding secured for this convening that we did in September. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to shape it really hit the ground running before I even started the role to do that. And we will do more of them, by the way. But I've been fortunate in that I think we talked about this whenever my first interview with you all what took place in September, probably, that it was in theater where I really was able to step out of the classical music, let's say, bubble, which often it is, and really see, and theater has done this in so many ways, and you've talked about that too, Scott, the value of the arts to tell stories, share perspectives, see the world through somebody else's eyes, even momentarily, to better understand the world around you than what you're personally experiencing. And that has really stayed with me. And for me, learning about the privilege and the real isolation I grew up in classical music has been just a personal journey. And now, as I think about what is my role to advocate for living composers and being a space where artists can find a sense of belonging and connection and support, it is absolutely ingrained in that mission. And I'm very proud that we as a board and as an organization just this weekend identified again, not only that diversity, equity, inclusion is a priority, but anti-racism. And if we're not going to say it now, when there's literally conflict outside of our windows, and we had a board meeting with sirens and helicopters all around us, then I don't know what it's going to take. So I'm very proud that we made that. We made that very clear, and of course, how we act on that will be even more meaningful.
Being
So for
in
me, it's a personal. Just to answer quickly, it's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
personal. It's a personal responsibility and priority, and I take that to the organization too.
You use the phrase anti-racism, and I think it's important to note that being an anti-racist is very specific. It's not the general sort of thing that people are may think of when they think about being opposed to racism. Vanessa, would you mind letting us know maybe what your definition or the way you see the very specific role of being an anti-racist?
So there's a book that Ibram X. Kendi just wrote that, for those interested, we're reading in our book club, which we'll be discussing the first Monday in July. I can't remember the date right now, but we have every Monday, the first Monday of each month at 4 p.m. Central, book club about a different book about race in America. And today actually is one of those days we're reading Toni Morrison. To me, why it matters to say anti-racist rather than diversity, et cetera, is I know and I hear and observe, and I've heard from many affected, that too often it's code. Diversity doesn't necessarily mean race. Diversity can mean many things, right? It's about difference. Inclusion is another very important word that's about a sense of belonging and feeling like you are welcome. And equity is also making sure people have what they need to be able to fully participate, not equality, equity, very different. Anti-racism, however, is an act. It is not, yes, we want to be a place for people to come. It's an active notion of combating racism, because the reality is we are all socialized. We've all been raised to have certain prejudices. We've all been raised to think certain things. We've seen it in media. It's all around us. We need to be conscious of that, and we need to make it a priority to consistently be aware of it. And by the way, fellow white people, we are going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. We're going to say the wrong thing. We are going to offend people, but we have to make it an active priority.
And let me add on to that. Not only are white people going to say the wrong thing and make mistakes, you're going to be corrected, and you need to be okay with that.
Yeah.
You have to build up that skin to understand that change takes a little bit of sacrifice, and oftentimes that sacrifice is uncomfortable. Scott, I wonder, you have said often, over the course of season 1 of Triloquy, that you've stepped in it, that you've made mistakes. What do you have to say to that experience, really being corrected there on the spot, and how you can change that, not only into a positive for yourself, but into a positive for the general fight of anti-racism?
I would tell people that anytime, okay, let's say somebody goes, what? I'm open. I'll talk to people. I'll have the conversation. Okay, go and have that conversation. And then when people point out what you're doing wrong, don't go, well, but here's the thing,
Right.
no. Shut up. Go home and think about it. And hopefully you'll come to a realization.
I appreciated your
I
white man impression there, by the way.
What do you mean impression? I woke up this way.
Shout out to Beyonce, but anyway.
Right on. No, this is and going back to what you were saying about anti-racism rather than diversity and all these things, that that is more on the nose sort of talk that we have to be having.
Yep.
Okay, there's no more window dressing of
Right.
diversity initiatives. No. We need action. We need verbs that really pinpoint what we're doing and be able to track it.
Yeah. And specific action, Vanessa, is something that you took yesterday as we're taping this. Would you mind letting everyone know the action you took and what your thoughts were behind it?
Sure. Well, I wrote my staff and said, let's close the office for this week. Let's put an out of office message and let's engage with our community. Our community needs us. If we are about community, and community means many things to different people, and it can actually be a very divisive term. So I define that as broadly as is meaningful for each person. But we have always prided ourselves in being Minnesota based and being an active member of the Twin Cities culture and world. And we need to engage with that. And whether it's volunteering or protesting peacefully or calling our officials, whatever is personally significant, I want my staff to feel they do not need to be beholden to an office schedule or regularly. This is not normal day-to-day life, and it is literally in front of us, in our neighborhoods, and our neighborhoods need us. So
yeah.
that too
Scott,
is an act of anti-racism in my view.
Scott, from the way I see it, I feel like I experienced an anti-racist action when this podcast, this project, was passed on to us. So, and I think actually we haven't really gone into it published, but long story short, at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, American public media, just as every organization has had to do, had to make sacrifices, and funding funding and backing TRILLOQUY was one of those things. With the help of our former fearless leader, who is now retired, Brian Newhouse, TRILLOQUY has been passed on to Scott and myself. All of the intellectual property, the copyright of the name, everything connected to TRILLOQUY belongs to us. And, I'll also say that in planning this conversation and planning this overture, we had originally toyed with comparing our story with the story of other podcasters, namely the podcast Call Her Daddy, also the Joe Rogan podcast, which recently earned itself over $100 million from Spotify for exclusivity. So we don't have the time to go into those specifics today. But Scott, I wanted to get your feedback on what I see as the anti-racist move that our former manager Brian Newhouse made by facilitating the continuation of this anti-racist podcast.
Brian Newhouse was a ninja on this one, I think.
He bodied it, as they say,
because
in my communities.
in your parlance, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess from our day, he was a pimp. He made a cool move, because how frustrated I was when it happened, because I felt like we were going to get a meeting with the vice president in charge of development, and I'm thinking, all right, now we're going to put some horsepower behind this now, and it's happening. And then we get the news that it's going to be handed off, and I'm kind of I'm half like, all right, thank you, and half like, well, why?
Right.
But then to find out later that he was taking voluntary early separation and going into retirement and handing it off to us at an economical price tag well below what it was valued, that was a chess move. And he did. And here's the thing, he didn't broadcast it. He didn't go, hey, look, everything's looking dangerous. I'm going to put my white man impression on again, since you think I do it so well. Hey, things are looking sketchy here for this. So why don't I act all, I'm going to really do you a favor. Didn't do any of that.
Right.
All of it was done silent. I appreciate that. That was a good move, a bold move, I thought.
Absolutely. I don't make a habit, and I will not make a habit out of, giving out white achievement crowns, the ally tag. That is not my job to do. With that being said, Brian Newhouse is someone that I have no choice but to consider an ally. The Triloquy, season 1 of Triloquy, I'll go ahead and tell everyone, was the price tag on that was $64,000. Okay, that is not the price we paid. I won't tell you the price we paid, but it wasn't $64,000. Brian Newhouse used his position to ensure the continuation of projects like this. You know, Vanessa, you're using your position, your role to enact community involvement and community change in the best way you can. And as I told the BBC this morning, if I may brag a little bit, I had a BBC interview.
Hey.
As I told them this morning, we all have a role. We all work in some corner of society in which anti-racism can be applied. You know, our corner happens to be so-called classical music, art music, and it can most certainly happen there. So in that regard, Vanessa, I really thank you for what you're doing for the American Composers Forum, and I would like to send my most heartfelt thanks to Brian Newhouse for making sure that Triloquy was a project and an initiative that would not die but would live and thrive as something independently owned and operated by us, a Black-owned podcast.
You're here.
Hey, hey.
All right, so let's go ahead and move into this final movement, our Triloquy. So if you're watching this under normal circumstances, both Scott and I will offer our personal hot take, you know, our Triloquy. But today, I'm just going to present one for us to kind of unpack a little bit before we wrap this overture up, bring it to a close. So I'm sure on both of your social medias and elsewhere, you're seeing critiques of the response to this tragedy, and them using Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy as a means of doing that. You know, the nonviolence. He would have hated that. All right, so I'm going to read an excerpt from Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from the Birmingham jail, and I'm going to take the back seat and let the two of you sort of react to it, because, you know, for all intents and purposes, he was talking to, if not you, many of your constituents. So here's the quote. He says, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. People who constantly say, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action.' People who paternalistically believe that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. People who live by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advise the Negro to wait for a so-called more convenient season." Those are words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. written in jail. First of all, an experience that many white people would never know, an experience that I have, something that a lot of people know. But, you know, from my perspective, basically what he is saying is that the white citizen's counselor, the person in the Ku Klux Klan, they are violent enough, they are challenging enough, but my biggest challenge are the so-called good white people, the well-intentioned white people that want to tell us how to react and how to find our own freedom. So what are your reactions to this fact from Dr. Martin Luther King that is so often ignored?
It's glaring. And anybody who wants to try to rationalize, any white person that wants to try to rationalize their way out of why they don't do something to help, then they still haven't heard it. It still hasn't landed for them. Garrett, you know that I'm not a table shaker. You know that I'm typically not one to pick up and join. I'm damn sure not one to join a riot. And I'm typically not one to join in a protest. This podcast for me is going to be my way of addressing my own issues and helping others to do it. So that's my goal.
I'm going to bring up that quote the next time you try to produce me.
What's that?
The next time you try to tell me what to say or how to say. I'm joking. I'm sorry.
Dude, that is the number one pile that I step in. Number one. I have stepped in that one so many times, and I hope that you know that I'm producing you from a radio perspective and not from a sociological perspective.
Just a little sweetness to add into the sour here.
Thanks, man. Thanks.
Vanessa, what are your reactions to that
see,
quote?
I already stepped in it in this podcast because as soon as I said it, I realized I said peaceful protests, but the reality is it doesn't have to be peaceful protests. That's kind of what we're talking about, right? It's the fact that
Right.
people have every right to be upset, and actually, I feel like it has to be. And now there are definitely people who are doing bad things in our community who are not after justice. And you know, that's still being investigated, but so I won't go down that rabbit hole, but and that to me is scarier. But I think it has to be loud, it has to be real and raw, or we're just going to go back to business as usual because we've seen this before, right? So I absolutely honor and respect what is happening in the protests, and just wanted to, you know, identify my own mistake a few minutes ago. Yeah, I think the Amy Cooper story alongside this has helped to penetrate this idea as well, right? She claims herself a liberal, and then she's like so many people. And this is something that Robin DiAngelo calls out in White Fragility as well. The most dangerous are the white progressives who think that, you know, oh, my best friend is Black, right? We've heard this. And like you, Scott, I am definitely not the revolutionary person. I, you know, pretty much try to not to abstain
Keep
from
your
social
head
media.
down. Keep
my head down. That is, I don't like being the spotlight. That's why I went into administration. I didn't like performing and being the soloist. And yet, I think in some ways that desire to not be in the spotlight makes me an effective leader, and especially in terms of being an empathetic leader to give others that platform, and that's what I seek to do. However, it matters what I do also, and I know that, and I try to use the platform I have to do that. I sent out an email last week that was definitely taking a stand and making a statement to our community, and we had people unsubscribe. And we also had some really lovely responses. And I just encourage our colleagues, again, who feel uncomfortable or worried about saying the wrong thing. I understand that. I definitely understand that. And I'm making those, you know, those mistakes as well.
But you can't let, you see, that's the thing,
you
is
can't
that
let it
you
keep
can't
you
let
back.
it paralyze, you can't let it paralyze you into inaction.
That's right.
And it's going to feel weird, and you're going to screw up, but you got to start doing it, man. You got to start stepping.
And it's time for us white people to make ourselves vulnerable. I think that's the main thing. We can't keep listening to people's, you know, we've been in all those conversations where there are panels and we're hearing from our friends and colleagues of color, the experiences they're having, and then we go home and do nothing. We have to make ourselves accountable. We have to make ourselves vulnerable. And that's one way to do it, is to do it. And there was a beautiful email sent out by Sarah Bellamy, who runs the Penumbra Theater here in the Twin Cities, and the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul, dedicated to the canon of African-American plays, theater, and community. And what she said to white colleagues and friends was, don't wait for us to tell you what to do, but be ready to listen when we're here to offer you constructive feedback and advice. And I think that is the greatest advice and way to encourage more collaboration.
As the denouement, as the coda to this overture to season 2 of TRILLOQUY, I'd love for the both of you to speak to your fellow Black woman and speak to your fellow white woman and white man. So when I see all of the, and maybe this can be a part of the TRILLOQUY, okay? Maybe this is a trill statement. When I see white people, well-intentioned white people at these protests demonstrating peacefully or however they choose, the first thought in my mind is, but have you talked to your Mima who uses the N-word? Have you addressed that neighbor or that colleague who feels comfortable saying racist things to your face, you know, in confidence? So the question that I have to the both of you, what message do you have to your fellow white person who you already know is not on board with the changes that we're trying to enact with these protests and beyond. What are your words to them? This person that I'm sure you know. I won't ask you to name them, but this time. But what are your words to them?
Go ahead.
Well, I think this can look like many different things. I mean, I think we're not asking people to start yelling. We're not asking people to, do what is your personality. There's a whole world out there of introvert activists, for example. There are ways to engage in this dialogue, whether it's one-on-one by asking questions. I mean, number one is just raise awareness, I mean, and this is the Anti-Racist Act, right? Don't just, don't be quiet. Whether it's asking questions, whether it's saying, I don't agree with you, whether it's talking about somebody you know and how that experience actually conflicts with what this person has just shared. I think there are many ways for you to do it. It doesn't have to be, being on the front line of the protest, but it's that everyday conversation experience and not letting it go by silently.
Scott?
I've always been sort of one to think eye for an eye leaves the world blind. But I would say to one person in particular, you feel like you're looking over your shoulder all of a sudden? You don't feel like your neighborhood is as safe as it was or whatever? How's that feel? How's that feel? Because there's, these people that you're talking about that you're so against probably walk around feeling like this all the time. So walk in those shoes lace them up, walk around for a little bit, for a week, until these protests calm down and the riots calm down. See how you feel then. Because all this anxiety and stress that I'm feeling right now, I know does not measure up, but it is a taste.
Vanessa, I want to really thank you once again for being our special guest co-host for this Overture to Season 2 of TRILLOQUY. For folks who don't know much about the American Composers Forum or what the ACF does, where can they learn more about that?
Composersforum.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Scott, as always, huge thanks to you. It's great to have you a partner here.
Yeah,
and I'm looking forward to what we bring forward for season 2. So by the time you're watching this, hopefully Opus 51 of TRILLOQUY will be available to you. Because of the sort of legal and official transition of TRILLOQUY from an American Public Media production to a Garrett McQueen and Scott Blankenship production, you may have to search for TRILLOQUY and resubscribe. I'm currently in the process of uploading our back catalog. But hopefully by the time you're watching this, the latest opus of TRILLOQUY, Opus 51, will be available. So thank you so much for watching. And in closing here, I think I'd like, and this is even new to you, Scott, I think I'd like to introduce the new sort of tagline, the new mission of TRILLOQUY. Previously, we were true and real stories from the fringes of classical music. Moving forward, you're going to hear TRILLOQUY, conversations that challenge the status quo of classical music. How do you like that, Scott?
Nice, man.
All right.
Nice.
Thank you so much again for all of your support. And we took a little bit more time off than I had originally planned, but it's great to be back wherever you are.
It was out of your hands. It was out of your hands.
Wherever you are, stay safe, stay anti-racist, and do the good work. Thanks so much for checking in with us.
Bye.